So today I want to start by reading two passages from the Old Testament. One is Genesis 3. The story that we all know um, about the well how the first couple was tricked. So I'll read the first four verses, I think. Now the snake was the most cunning animal that the Lord had made. The snake asked the woman, "Did God really tell you not to eat fruit from any tree in the garden?" "We may not eat the fruit of any tree in the garden," the woman answered, "except the tree in the middle of it. God told us not to eat the fruit of that tree or even touch it. If we do, we will die." The snake replied, "That is not true. You will not die. God said that because God knows that when you eat it, you will be like God and know what is good and what is bad." The woman saw how beautiful the tree was and how good its fruit would be to eat, and she thought it was wonderful. It would be wonderful to become wise and blah blah blah. Now, the reason I thought of this passage was because most of the time when we are told, when at least when I was, whenever I hear people preaching on this passage, what they say is that the problem was disobedience. But today I want to read this as a problem of trickery. And in fact, in verse 13, when God asks the woman, "Why did you eat?" she said, "The snake tricked me." When the serpent comes to talk to the woman, the serpent asks, "Did God really say?" That's where the trick is. Because what that question does, that question makes her self-doubt. It makes her doubt, what does she know? Is it legitimate? And then once the doubt has been planted, the serpent is able to add and say, "Well, God didn't really say." But the serpent would not have been able to convince Eve if he had not started by saying, with that question of self-doubt. If the serpent had not planted the self-doubt, then Eve might have not um, done what she did. And I'm talking about the story. I'm not talking about everything about human beings since then. And why was the serpent asking, "Did God really say?" The point was to prove God wrong. Eve's problem was not that she disobeyed, it's that she doubted. And she doubted because she assumed that the serpent's question was innocent. She assumed it was simply a scientific fact that he was verifying. Did God really say? So she took it literally and thought that this was just a scientific question. But it wasn't a scientific question. It was a question which was planted to create self-doubt and then eventually to prove God wrong. But of course, the serpent didn't start by saying that. The serpent did come and announce, "Oh, I want to prove God wrong. I want to tell you that God was not right." That's not what the serpent does. The serpent starts by asking a question. And because Eve was naive, she did not see that the intention of the question was other than the scientific fact of what God said and didn't say. So the reason why I'm bringing up this story is because the problem of Africa when it comes to knowledge is this. We're always being asked, is it really true? Are you sure? Where is the proof? Where is the scientific fact? We are always being doubted about the knowledge that we have. And so we start trying to prove the questioner right. So when in the beginning we were asked, "Are you really African? Are you really civilized? Are you really cultural? Do you have any accomplishments the way Europe has accomplishments?" We were asked all these questions and we were naive. we didn't think, why are these questions being asked? Instead, we started to answer them. And we started following the questions that we were given. And it never occurred to us that these questions are distracting us. They're making us answer things that we are not interested in. And there's an African-American writer called Toni Morrison who talks about this. And she says that racism is a distraction. It keeps us answering questions that are not even ours, but we assume that it's important to answer these questions because it's scientific. And this is what she said. She said, I quote, "The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and so you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge it up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, and so you dredge that up. None of that is necessary. There will always be one more thing. If we don't question, or if we don't really interrogate the questions we are being asked, we start answering questions that are not ours. We start aspiring for things that are not in our interests. And in the end, we stray so far away, not because we were not scientific enough, but because we didn't ask who is asking this question and why. What do they want? Why am I raising this? Last week, when we were having the discussion about what is subjective or not subjective, I thought about that more later. You remember the example that I gave was about intelligence. I said that in the 1930s, there was some guy at Mathare Hospital who was doing experiments on Africans. And so he was measuring our heads and our brains to say that we are not intelligent enough, that we don't mature beyond the age of 13 and all that. And that was disproved as hogwash or as nonsense. Later on, we were given exams. When more Africans started entering the school system, they were given exams. They were given exams to make sure you weed out people. But what was the reason for those exams we were given? We were told it's a measure of intelligence or of learning. And we never asked who has the right to measure our intelligence? Or why should we have exams in the first place? Instead, what has happened, which was what I was saying last week, instead what has happened is that we are trying to improve the system. We are trying to make better exams. We are trying to make better classes. But nobody is asking, why do we have these measurements in the first place? Whose agenda is served by having these things in our systems? And I'm not talking just about exams. There's so many things which we have just never questioned. Whether some questions are worth answering, we don't talk about those things. Instead, what we do is that we bring African data to answer questions that were not set us by us. So what we are really doing, because sometimes I have always asked, who said that this is important? Who said we must have it this way? Even before we answer the question, how do we do it? It's important to establish whether this is our question in the first place. And what we are doing is avoiding asking those questions about the serpent. The serpent has come, is asking us strange questions. Are you civilized? Are you developed? Developed is the big one. Have you met this goal and the other goal? Are you meeting international standards? And we don't ask who set these standards, how are they set? What we say is, we're not quite meeting them, but we are going to go and try. And we don't ask, where did these standards come from? Why are we following them? Of what value are they? How are they set up? And then we spend time, like Toni Morrison said, we just spend time trying to answer these questions, which are not ours in the first place. What we are really doing is trying to avoid asking questions about the serpent. And actually, the answer to many of our questions is to start asking those questions. Who is asking the questions? And what do they want by us answering? That means we have to be brave enough to ask. And that's what we are not brave enough to do in Kenya. People will gaslight you. I'm going to talk about gaslighting later on. People gaslight you. They say, oh no, where's the proof? All these things we are asked so that we don't ask who is asking the questions and what is their interest in asking those questions. So what we have to do is to look at the serpent. The serpent isn't pleasant, but we have to look at those questions. And it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. It's not pleasant work. Many times we are called names, but we have to do the work. We have to look at the serpent. And now in Numbers 21, there's a story of God telling the Israelites, because what had happened is that they were in the wilderness, they got sick. They started complaining. Numbers 21:4. They started complaining. Why are you bringing us here? Why did you waste our time bringing us to the desert where there's no food and water? And God got annoyed and they started being bitten by poisonous snakes. And then when that happened, verse 7, they said to Moses, we sinned against you when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Now pray to the Lord to take these snakes away. So Moses prayed for the people. Then the Lord told Moses to make a metal snake and put it on a pole so that anyone who was bitten could look at it and be healed. We have to look at these snakes. We are going to be gaslighted. We are going to be told we are bringing questions which don't need to be asked. But the real thing is that many of our problems in Kenya, we cannot heal them until we look at those snakes. We have to look at them and we have to ask the questions. We have to ask where these questions come from. In whose interests are they asked? Instead of being like Eve, naive Eve, and trying to answer questions whose goal is not knowledge, but something else. And the way to look at these questions is to look at history. Mamdani says that there's no graduate education without history. History of what? We're not talking about kings and queens and when they died and what battles they fought. History is bigger than that. History is the history of ideas. How did certain ideas emerge? Where did these theories come from, the ones you're going to be using? What experiences are they based on? Those are historical questions, and you need to be able to read history of ideas and of the theorists you're talking about to answer those questions.